An elite professor forced the maid's daughter to solve a math problem. Unaware, she is a mathematical genius. The morning was supposed to be ordinary. A mother pushing her cleaning cart down polished marble floors. A daughter, clutching a worn book, told to stay close and keep quiet. But in the grand lecture hall of Crestwood University, silence didn't last long. A professor, armed with chalk and pride, unveiled an equation he claimed would bridge the gaps in modern physics. The room sat in awe, except for one quiet voice in the back. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone sharp. I think there is," came the hesitant reply. What followed wasn't supposed to happen. A child, barely 12 years old, was challenged to confront a problem that had stumped minds far older, far more celebrated. The audience expected silence, or humiliation. What they witnessed instead was something no one could explain. This is the story of how one little girl, meant to be invisible, solved the unsolvable. Just before we dive in, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. We love seeing how far these stories reach. And make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss tomorrow's special video. Now let's jump back in. Enjoy the story. A 12-year-old girl held the secret to a problem that had stumped the world's greatest minds. She sat silently in the back of the grand lecture hall, a place she was only meant to clean. But today, she was about to teach its most arrogant professor a lesson in humility. The morning sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Crestwood University. It was a place of old money and older traditions. The stone buildings stood like silent judges, their ivy-covered walls having witnessed generations of ambition and intellect. For Helen Miller, it was simply her place of work. She pushed her heavy cleaning cart down the polished marble hallway of the mathematics building, the wheels squeaking a familiar, rhythmic complaint. Her movements were efficient, born of a decade spent wiping away the footprints of others. Beside her, a small figure struggled to keep up, her short legs working hard to match her mother's practiced pace. Abigail Miller, all of 12 years old, clutched a worn copy of a book on number theory. Her blonde hair was tied back in a simple ponytail, but a few stray strands had escaped, catching the light like spun gold. She had the day off from school for a teacher workday, a rare chance to spend the morning with her mother. For Abby, accompanying her mother to the university wasn't a chore. It was a pilgrimage. She loved the quiet dignity of the halls, the scent of old paper and floor wax, and the hushed, important whispers that seemed to seep from the very walls. "Stay close, Abby," Helen said, her voice soft but firm. She glanced down at her daughter, a familiar mix of love and worry in her eyes. "Dr. Thorne is giving a special lecture in the Grand Hall today. We need to be finished in this wing before the students arrive." Abby nodded, her gaze fixed on the posters lining the hallway. They were filled with complex equations and grainy photographs of thoughtful-looking men and women. She traced a symbol with her finger, a partial derivative she recognized from one of her grandfather's old textbooks. Her great-grandfather, General Harrison Vance, had been more than just a war hero. He had been a codebreaker, a man who saw the world in patterns and logic. He believed that mathematics was the language of the universe, and that discipline was its grammar. Before he passed, he had spent hours with a very young Abby, not with toys, but with puzzles and paradoxes. He taught her to see numbers not as a chore, but as a silent, beautiful story. He had bequeathed her his mind, his books, and his most prized possession, a conviction that the most complex problems had the simplest, most elegant solutions if you only had the courage to look for them. Helen stopped her cart outside the doors of the Whitaker Grand Lecture Hall. It was the largest on campus, a magnificent amphitheater of dark wood and deep red velvet seats. A massive chalkboard, wiped clean and waiting, dominated the front of the room. "All right," Helen said, pulling out her supplies. "You can sit in the back corner while I work. But you must be absolutely quiet, do you understand? As quiet as a mouse." "I will, Mama," Abby promised. She slipped into the very last row, her small frame almost disappearing in the large, plush seat. She opened her book, but her eyes were drawn to the imposing stage and the man who had just walked onto it. This was Dr. Wallace Thorne. He was exactly as his reputation described him. Tall, impeccably dressed in a tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, and wearing an expression of permanent, mild disappointment in the world around him. He was a titan in the field of theoretical physics, a man whose intellect was matched only by his arrogance. He arranged his notes on the polished lectern, his movements precise and dismissive, as if the very air was not quite up to his standards. Students began to file in, filling the tiered seats. They were graduate students and faculty members, the best and brightest the university had to offer. They spoke in low, reverent tones, their notebooks open, their pens poised. A palpable sense of anticipation filled the room. Dr. Thorne was known for his challenging lectures, and today's topic was particularly dense: non-commutative geometry and its application to quantum loopholes. Helen worked quickly and quietly along the far aisle, her back to the stage, emptying trash bins and wiping down railings. She was a ghost in the room, part of the scenery, utterly invisible to the academic elite who were settling into their seats. She wanted to be done and gone before the lecture officially began, before anyone could question why a child was present. Abby watched, fascinated. She didn't understand all the words on the lecture description, but she saw the patterns in the preliminary equations Dr. Thorne began to sketch on the board. He moved with an unearned flourish, his chalk strokes sharp and aggressive. He was not just writing, he was performing. The standard model, he began, his voice booming through the hall, is, for all its celebrated success, an incomplete tapestry. He paused for effect, letting his pronouncement settle. It fails to account for gravitational singularities. It is, to put it plainly for the less nimble minds among us, a theory full of holes. A few sycophantic chuckles rippled through the front rows. Abby saw her mother flinch slightly at his tone and begin working her way faster toward the exit. Dr. Thorne continued his lecture, weaving a complex web of logic and calculation. He filled the board with symbols that made Abby's heart beat a little faster. It was like listening to a piece of music she almost knew. She followed his work, her mind racing to keep up. He was brilliant, there was no denying it. His arguments were intricate, his knowledge vast. But as he reached the core of his new proof, a central equation that he claimed would bridge the gap in the standard model, Abby saw it. It was a small thing, a tiny, almost insignificant assumption in his initial setup. A variable substitution that was elegant, clever, but fundamentally flawed. It created a paradox. Under certain boundary conditions, the entire equation would collapse into meaninglessness. It was the kind of mistake a person makes when they are so in love with their own brilliance that they forget to check the foundation. She didn't mean to make a sound. It was a tiny gasp, a sharp intake of breath so quiet that only one person could have possibly heard it. Dr. Thorne stopped mid-sentence. His head snapped up, his hawk-like eyes scanning the room for the source of the interruption. His gaze swept over the rows of rapt students and landed, with cold precision, on the small girl in the back row. He saw her book, her wide, attentive eyes, and then, with a flick of his gaze, he saw the cleaning cart and the woman in the gray uniform who was now frozen by the exit. His lip curled into a sneer. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. He wasn't speaking to the academics. He was speaking to her. Every head in the lecture hall turned. 100 pairs of eyes landed on the little girl in the last row. Abby felt a hot blush creep up her neck. She shrank down in her seat, wishing she could disappear into the red velvet. Beside her, she could feel her mother's panic, a silent, vibrating wave of fear. No, sir," Abby stammered, her voice barely a whisper. "No," Dr. Thorne repeated, amplifying the word. He took a slow step down from the stage, moving closer, enjoying the sudden shift in atmosphere. He had found a diversion, a way to underscore his own superiority. "It seemed you had a reaction to my work. Perhaps you've discovered a flaw? Perhaps you'd like to enlighten us all?" Cruel laughter spread through the audience. It was quiet at first, then bolder. Students exchanged smirks. A professor in the front row shook his head with a weary sigh, as if this was typical of Thorne's behavior. Helen stood rigid by the door, her face pale. She wanted to run to her daughter, to shield her, but she was paralyzed by the weight of so many important eyes. "My daughter was just leaving," Helen said, her voice trembling slightly. "I apologize for the disturbance, Doctor." Dr. Thorne ignored her completely. His focus was entirely on Abby, a predator toying with its prey. "Come now," he pressed, a malicious glint in his eye. "Don't be shy. We are all scholars here. Or mostly." He let that final word hang in the air, a clear insult to Helen's presence. Abby clutched her book to her chest. Her mind was a whirlwind of her great-grandfather's words. Never be afraid of the truth, Abigail. Numbers do not lie, and they do not judge. People do. It's just. She began, her voice still shaky. In the third line, the Kontorovich substitution. The laughter died instantly. A deep, profound silence fell over the hall. The students and faculty stared, mouths slightly agape. The Kontorovich substitution was not an elementary concept. It was a complex technique used in advanced quantum mechanics. For a child to even know the name was startling. Dr. Thorne's smug expression faltered for a fraction of a second. Surprise, then annoyance, flickered across his face. He quickly masked it with a look of feigned patience. Ah, the Kontorovich substitution. And what, precisely, is your expert opinion on it? He was still mocking her, but now there was a sharp edge to his tone. He had been caught off guard and did not like it. It doesn't remain stable when you approach a zero-point energy field, Abby said, a little more confidently now. The mathematics was a safe place, a fortress of logic where his condescension couldn't touch her. The equation becomes undefined. The silence in the room became heavier, charged with disbelief. A visiting professor from Caltech, a kind-faced older woman named Dr. Evelyn Reed, leaned forward in her seat, her brow furrowed in concentration as she looked back at the board. She saw what the child was talking about. She saw the flaw. Dr. Thorne stared at Abby, his face hardening. The amusement was gone, replaced by a cold fury. This was not just an interruption anymore. It was a challenge to his authority, coming from the most humiliating source imaginable. The daughter of the maid. Is that so? He said, his voice dangerously quiet. An expert on zero-point energy fields. How remarkable. And where did you acquire this advanced knowledge? Your elementary school playground. The insult was sharp, meant to cut deep and put her back in her place. But Abby didn't shrink this time. She thought of her mother, standing mortified by the door. She thought of her great-grandfather, who had faced down entire armies with less fear than she felt now. My great-grandfather taught me, she said simply. Dr. Thorne let out a short, dismissive laugh. And I suppose your great-grandfather was a Nobel laureate? He was General Harrison Vance, Abby said, her voice clear and steady. The name dropped into the silent room like a stone. General Harrison Vance, the hero of the Ardennes campaign, the legendary strategist and codebreaker, the man for whom the university's College of Applied Sciences was named. The name Vance Hall was carved in stone above the main entrance. Dr. Thorne froze. His face went blank with shock. Every person in that room knew the name. They walked through the building named after him every single day. The connection was so absurd, so unbelievable, that no one knew how to react. But Thorne recovered quickly, his arrogance a shield against the impossible. He saw this not as a moment for humility, but as a challenge to be crushed. He would prove that this was a fluke, a lucky guess, a name dropped for effect. General Vance was a soldier, not a physicist. He snapped, his composure cracking. His sentimentality has no place in rigorous science. He turned his back on her and walked decisively toward the chalkboard. He was no longer playing. He was attacking. Since you are so confident, he announced to the room, let us put this expertise to a practical test. He picked up a piece of chalk, the snap as he broke it in half echoing in the tense silence. He gestured with the chalk toward the stage. Come forward, little girl. Come to the board. Helen took a step forward. No, she pleaded softly. Please, sir. She's just a child. But Dr. Thorne's gaze was locked on Abby. It was a command, a dare. The entire room held its breath. They were about to witness either the most brutal humiliation of a child or something they could not yet begin to comprehend. Abby looked at her mother's terrified face. Then she looked at the vast, empty chalkboard. It was a battlefield. Her great-grandfather had taught her that you never back down from a fight for the truth. With a deep breath that did little to calm her hammering heart, Abigail Miller stood up and began the long walk to the front of the lecture hall. The walk from the last row to the stage felt like a mile. Each small footstep echoed in the cavernous room. The faces she passed were a blur of expressions: pity, morbid curiosity, disdain, and on the face of Dr. Reed, a look of intense, focused interest. Abby kept her eyes forward, fixed on the sea of green slate before her. She was keenly aware of her simple dress, her slightly scuffed shoes, and the fact that she was a child in a world of adults. She felt like an imposter, a trespasser about to be exposed. Her mother, Helen, remained by the doors, one hand pressed against her mouth. She was caught in an impossible position. Every maternal instinct screamed at her to snatch her daughter and run, to protect her from the public evisceration that was about to occur. But another part of her, a part that had seen Abby solve complex problems in her notebooks late at night, a part that remembered the fierce pride in her grandfather's eyes as he spoke of the child's gift, was frozen in place. She could not bring herself to interfere with this strange, terrifying destiny that was unfolding. Abby reached the stage and stepped up onto the raised platform. She was so small she seemed swallowed by the space. The lectern towered over her. Dr. Thorne stood beside the chalkboard, a grim, self-satisfied expression on his face. He had successfully turned this into a spectacle, and he was the ringmaster. "Now," he said, his voice loud and patronizing, "let's not overcomplicate things. We'll start with a simple warm-up exercise." He turned to the board and, with swift, precise strokes, wrote out a partial differential equation. To the graduate students in the room, it was a standard, if challenging, problem from fluid dynamics. The Navier-Stokes equation adapted for a non-Newtonian fluid. It was something a doctoral candidate would be expected to solve, but it was by no means simple. For a 12-year-old, it should have been as incomprehensible as a foreign language. The word simple was an act of pure academic cruelty. "Take your time," Dr. Thorne said, the false generosity in his tone making it clear he expected her to stand there in humiliated silence until he dismissed her. He held out the piece of chalk. Abby's hand trembled as she reached for it. The chalk felt cold and foreign in her small fingers. She stared at the equation on the board. The symbols swirled in her vision for a moment, a chaotic jumble. The weight of all those eyes felt like a physical pressure. Behind her, she heard a student whisper to another, "This is cruel." Even for Thorne. She took a slow, deep breath, just as her great-grandfather had taught her. "Center yourself, Abigail. Look at the terrain. Don't see the enemy. See the problem. The problem is never personal." The numbers and symbols began to settle. The chaos receded. She saw the flow. She saw the relationships between the variables. It was a system, and like any system, it had rules. It had a beginning and an end. She had never seen this exact equation before, but she had seen hundreds like it in her great-grandfather's books. He had been obsessed with fluid dynamics, believing its principles applied to everything from airflow over a wing to the movement of troops on a battlefield. She raised the chalk to the board. The tip hovered for a moment, a tiny white speck against a vast green universe. And then, she made her first mark. The room was silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was the silence of intense concentration. Dr. Thorne leaned back against the lectern, arms crossed, a smirk still playing on his lips, ready to watch her fail. Abby began to write. Her first few lines were hesitant, the chalk strokes a bit shaky. She was laying out her initial conditions, defining her terms. Then, her confidence grew. Her hand became steadier. The scratching of the chalk was the only sound in the hall. She moved from one line to the next with a methodical grace that was unnerving. She wasn't guessing. She was navigating.